All right, everyone, welcome back to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm your host, Ian Fisher, this week, and we are starting to really get into it with juniors who are applying to college in the coming fall. And what that means for juniors is that the filling out of the application was just over the horizon. Now, as that's starting to happen, one of the core components is how students represent their extracurricular involvement through the materials provided by the various application platforms out there. And joining me to talk about what we call the activities list is my colleague, Joy Biscornet. Hey, Joy, how's it going?
Hi, Ian. I'm doing well. Happy to be here to talk about the activities section
The
with you today.
activities section, which I think
Yeah,
is probably the most underrated, important part of the application for my money. Like, I think students sort of see it as something that, like, oh, okay, I just got to fill out what I've done outside of the classroom. But like colleges, I think really focus on this area. There's a lot of potential to tell a story about what you've been doing outside of the classroom here.
definitely. I totally agree with you. And when speaking with students, we're talking about filling out applications. What I say to them is the two pieces of the application that will likely take you the most time are drafting the college essay, because that's not a one and done, but that's a completely separate conversation to have,
That's right.
and the activities section, because I think, like you said, students think, oh, I just have to write down what I have to do, and I can if I'm doing the Common App, I only have room for 10.
That's right.
So that'll be easy. When in fact, students can get really tripped up in how to organize their activities, how much time they've actually spent, how to highlight their impact with those activities, because that section really needs is asking for students to be very clear and succinct in the
Mm-hmm.
description of how they spend their time outside of the classroom.
That's right. And the description, actually, the space allowed, I used to say it's a little bit more space than a tweet, but ever since Twitter expanded to 280 characters, you have less space now than a
That's what I
tweet
say.
to be
Like
able to
half a
describe.
tweet.
Yeah, so it's pretty challenging. Now we're going to try something really different here on the show. It's not like revolutionary, but we're going to do a screen share. And I actually want to
Nice.
see if we can pull up a version of the common application. Now, every application platform is going to have a different version of how they ask for activities. And I'm hoping that this is something that's going to work on our Facebook page when we post this video and everybody can see what we're looking at here. I know, Joy, you can see what I pulled up here, right?
I can.
Awesome.
Yes.
And so, folks, if you're listening on the radio show, you can create your own account for the Common App at commonapp.org and follow along with us, or you can go and find the video and you can see what we're looking at here today. And so just a couple of things that I want to just point out really quickly. We're in the Common App tab here. And over on the left-hand side, we've got information about profile, family, education, and testing. Those are all data entry. There is not anything there that requires intellectual thought. There aren't any free response questions of any kind. There are open and shut. Where do you go to high school? Who's your counselor? What are your parents' names? And so, Joy, I think sometimes when people come to the activity section, they see this, they just assume that it's more data entry,
Right.
but it really isn't. So I'm going to open this up and maybe you can tell some of our listeners what we are seeing here and just how to engage with this platform.
Sure. So the activity section is where students can really start to put themselves into the application. So it's not just that, what's your name, what's your birth date, what's your address. This is a way for them to really start. This is the time where they can start to reflect on how they've spent their time with extracurricular activities. And I think of extracurricular activities as anything that a student is involved with outside of class. So
Yeah.
it doesn't just have to be related to school. It could be school clubs. It could be really being really involved with your your larger community. Maybe you're very involved at your church or your synagogue or your mosque. Maybe you babysit. Maybe you have a part-time job. All of these things in the eyes of the admission committees are considered extracurricular activities.
That's right. And because this is the Common App, you'll see there's also a catch-all here that says, among all those other established things, there's also other experiences that have been meaningful to you. And so that the key phrase there is meaningful to you. But if there's something that you're doing that has been organized to some extent, that you've worked through, like let's say you decided that you were going to read Robert Caro's biography on Lyndon Johnson as a form of independent study, you can put that in your activities list. And it's a great way to account for that project, which is no small feat, right? So like those are some interesting things that I think students might think about. Now, Joy, I'm going to scroll on down here so that everybody can see what an activity entry looks like. And I think here's where people get a little bit surprised, is that it does look like a data entry form. You've got 4 boxes here. One is a drop-down list. The other 3 are free response boxes. And then we've got, you can check off when you've actually participated in these things, how many hours you spend per week, how many weeks per year. The question I want to ask you is, given that we've got just these free response boxes here, how should students go about preparing to enter the information in? Is this like I log into the Common App and I go and type in all my activity stuff? Should they do it elsewhere? How do they engage with the actual process of drafting their activities list?
Much like the essay, where I would never suggest to a student, oh, just go into the text box of the application and start drafting your college essay.
Right.
I never suggest, oh, just go into the activity section and jot something down. It's really quick. It's only 150 characters. I suggest using a spreadsheet to start. Now, some students might prefer a Word document. Some students might just like to jot things down with pen and paper. Whatever it is, don't start with the Common App. This is, or any application. This should be where you put your final entry. Once you've wordsmithed your entries, once you know that you have the right character count. So that's why I like a spreadsheet, because then you can just cut and paste right into each section of these free response.
That's right. And what I've done here is sort of I execute what I think a student might do if they were just thinking about this as entering data entry. You might say, okay, what's the position in the leadership description? Hamilton Peer Tutoring, I'm on the board of officers. I put that there. Then I'm asked the organization name. Well, it's peer tutoring at Hamilton, so I put that in. And you can already see there's some redundancy that's happening there because I'm answering each question at face value. And then finally, it says, please describe this activity, including what you've accomplished and any recognition you've received, et cetera. And I've written, I tutor my peers and serve on the board of officers. Now, if I take each of those questions on their own and give a response, these are fair responses to these questions, but I have been super redundant by saying the same thing 3 times over, rather than thinking about each of these boxes as being able to contribute to a larger piece of the pie of what I've done as a part of this program. Who have I tutored? In what subjects? What does a board of officers actually do? What's our governing responsibility in that context, right? So there's a lot of really interesting stuff you can get to in this space, but it's so hard to do it when you're actually working within the context of the application.
Yeah, and just the way that you answering these 3 or putting in information in these 3 boxes at face value, if I were an admission counselor, I would look at this and already I have questions saying, well, how do you how do you have a seat on the board of officers?
Right.
Was it an elected position? Was it appointed? I'm even wondering, Hamilton Peer Tutoring. Is your high school named Hamilton? Is this an outside organization? And in that description, I'd like to know, I'm questioning, how many students do you tutor? Is it in a particular subject area, or is it kind of you're a jack of all trades, and if you're tutoring someone who needs help with English, and the next time you might be tutoring someone who needs help with biology, how old are these students? Because if you're tutoring middle school students, the subjects are going to be very different from if you were, and your approach might be very different than if you were tutoring a high school student. Even though it says peer tutoring, that could still be kind of an umbrella for which you do different types of tutoring as part of Hamilton peer tutoring.
That's right. And so there's so much that you can provide here. And I think that this is why you want to draft in another space, because if I get to the end of my 150 character count and keep typing because there's more I want to say about Hamilton, I can't go past this point. So there's no opportunity for me to see what's the full story that I would like to tell. And then how do I actually trim this down to be as efficient as I possibly can be in this context? I think another thing, Joy, what's your thought on basic reporting of fact versus a little bit of an opportunity to be creative in this context and ways for students to show some personality where it may be appropriate for them to do so? How should students think about that?
I think adding a little bit of personality or voice when appropriate is a great addition, because again, it can give the reader of your application a bit more of a sense of who you are and what's important to you. So just like this, if you are in this description, if you are talking about your basketball team and you have given all the information that really gives a sense of your impact on that team. So you've noted that you've won awards for being the best post player or league MVP 9 times in 4 years. Which you said, which is amazing.
Which is amazing.
Which you blocked over 2,000 shots. Go Raptors. Like, that gives a sense of you are a high school student. You do have, there is excitement to your participation. Conversely, if you just said in that box, go Raptors, I'd say, well, that's a missed opportunity. What does that mean? How have you contributed? Were you the mascot and like that was your battle cry? Or, were you just not really putting in a full effort?
That's right. I love that idea of like, you've got to give some more flex here. And I think the space where there's an opportunity can be in descriptions like basketball. And for those of you who are listening on the podcast, I'm playing around here with some of the entries, and that's why Joy and I are laughing a little bit. But with basketball, I mean, if I just say I'm a point guard for the varsity basketball team, that could be all that there is, because people generally know what basketball is. They know what point guard means. But if there is some color that you can add, even if it's not focused on particular achievements on the court, if it's focused on your enjoyment of the sport, take that opportunity. If you're a creative writer and you want to bring a little bit of creativity to this entry, go for it. But you also want to be sure that your personality is coming through, right? So if you're not somebody that has a sense of humor, trying to be funny in this context may not work so well for you and might not fit with the rest of the application. So be authentic, but also, see what you can do in some of these spaces.
And something that I do just want to remind students and parents, if you're reviewing the application, in that description section, for common abbreviations or acronyms for clubs, NHS, DECA, HOSA, you don't have to take up that character count to tell the reader what DECA is or what HOSA is. These are nationally recognized organizations that admission officers are going to know that if you write NHS, that's National Honor Society. So be very critical of how you use your character count, and edit until you can get it exactly to say, yeah, this highlights my impact. They'll know what I did for this organization.
That's a great point, is that, you don't have to describe those things that we all know. You don't have to tell us what the selection criteria is for NHS, because that's pretty universal. There's a lot of stuff that admission officers see all the time. And so you don't have to give us context for that. But there might be some abbreviations we're unfamiliar with. There might be something that we don't know. We actually had a really great exchange on our internal chat last week, talking about how a student could tell the story of the position that they rode in crew and what that means and how to assign that. And there was a great exchange of what's the most efficient way to tell this story. And that question of efficiency, I think, is a really interesting one, Joy. I think students have a tendency to believe, well, this has to be a complete sentence. I've got to, have my grammar all figured out. Everything has to be perfect with conventions. How do you feel about abbreviations, incomplete sentences, use of things like semicolon? Like, how do students actually think about filling out that box? Should it read like a paragraph or like a short set of sentences, or can they be a little bit more flexible?
I appreciate when giving students some leeway and being more flexible. I almost see it as um, a resume, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So, with a traditional resume, you'll have the company or the organization, your position, and then your accomplishments. And a strong resume has action in those kind of bullet points of what you did.
That's right.
So I tell students to use that way of thinking when filling out that description section. So I don't need bullet points, but you can forego full sentences to get to the action. Use semicolons to separate your accomplishments or the different roles that you had. I'm okay with that. Where your grammar and your sentence structure needs to be on point is in your personal statement. This is give me the quick info that I need to know, the nuts and bolts of what you did.
Yeah. And then take a step back and look at the whole thing. I think it can sometimes be interesting. You might look at one particular entry and say, that looks great. But then you look at 3 entries and you see, I've used the verb participated to start every single one of these entries, or researched over and over. Can I come up with some different words so that this feels like a whole project that somebody is reading from start to finish, and they're getting new information about me all the way through? The other thing, I had a student that I worked with a few years ago, and I remember he had done a lot of really interesting stuff, research stuff, independent projects, building things in his garage, some really cool stuff. But he wanted to shove a lot of that content into the tiny space that was allotted. And so he used a ton of abbreviations, and it made it feel in that first draft like it was really rough. Like there just wasn't any accessibility. It was hard to download all of that information as a reader. And so we talked about ways that you could actually change that so that there's a little bit more room. You might lose some of the details, but on the whole, the total project is going to be a little bit stronger as a result. Joy, when should students, just as we're signing off here, when should students start to think about getting their activities together? Is there any recommendation for younger students here? And then when's the time to start drafting an actual activities list for the application itself?
I suggest that in your freshman year, start that spreadsheet. I know it may seem way too early, but when you're thinking about how many hours you've spent on an activity, what time of the year, if you wait until September of your senior year, you're going to say, what was my role in 9th grade when I first got involved with Key Club? And if you start it early, then you can keep adding to that description. So when you do start to actually pull together your activities list, I would say now is a great time to start. Juniors in the spring into the summer, you can start working on your kind of narrowing down those activities or to the top 10 if you've got more than 10. You can start massaging your language to get it into that concise description. So I think start early to start collecting that information, and then spring of junior year, start getting it ready.
Yeah, I'm sort of reminded of having to do an annual performance review and sitting there and trying to remember, okay, what did I do this last year? And I'll be like, okay, well, I hosted the radio show and I answered some emails. Like you think about what you did most recently, but if you're tracking that over the course of the year, it's like, oh yeah, I remember when I did that way back a year ago, and that's just a year.
You can see your own growth over your high school career, and then maybe what characteristics or traits are you demonstrating in the growth of as seen through your activities section of your application.
I think that's right. And you can point to some really great other opportunities that connect outside of that, including connection to scholarships. And we're going to talk in a moment about scholarships and how those can connect to a student's extracurricular profile, how they can search for those. Joy, I want to thank you for coming on and bearing with me with the screen share. I hope that that was fun for our viewers.
Always a pleasure, Ian.
Always a pleasure. Thanks a lot for being here. Folks, when we come back, we're going to talk about scholarships, so don't go away.